Okay, well, welcome to our next edition of Parental Guidance, where dads with great dad bods talk about their favorite kids' books. John, do you want to talk about the book we're going to be talking about?
So something from nothing is basically the idea that someone can produce a product, such as a blanket, and it carries on in different forms as a child ages. So it goes from a blanket to a coat to a vest to a handkerchief and then a tie and a button, and finally into the miracle of human creativity into a wonderful story, which almost from a Inception like or even Tenet like, you, the reader, are participating in the creation of the final story, which is the story. So I think that part of the book is my favorite. When you
Like the
come to
end, the ending, right?
the ending, yeah, of
Oh.
course. But I really think at some level this book is not for children, and I think it's for adults.
Mm. So it's a basic story about a kid who basically gets a blanket and, as you said, just keeps on as he grows up. He changes into smaller and smaller things. His grandpa tears it into smaller things, but yeah, eventually
That's
there's
right.
nothing but a good experience, but a story.
Hmm. So Doug, did you want to throw a question our way?
Yeah, like so, I'm in the Jewish sense, a brother from another mother. I spend a lot of time around you guys, but not Jewish myself.
But
Um,
isn't it true you lived in a Jewish area where you?
I did. So I don't know that much about Jewish culture, but it's obvious the guy has a what do you call it, yarmulke? The granddad has a. It looks like it's set in maybe some Eastern European, um, you know, 18th century, 19th century Jewish town or something.
Mhm.
Yes.
So my question is, like, I guess it goes back to, and is this like a Yiddish book? Like, is this based on a Yiddish community?
This is an Ashkenaz Jew. So there's two types of Jews.
Oh,
There's the
okay.
African Jews, which are Sephardic, and then there's the North Russian, Polish, sort of Ukrainian Jew. That's the Ashkenaz Jew, and those people are living in a shtetl, which is basically a Jewish
Oh.
community. They're forced to be there, and you also have to understand that the grandfather's role as a tailor is one of requirement in the sense that Jews can't go and buy clothes. They have to make their own because they're not exactly wealthy. They're not exactly capable.
Oh.
They're not exactly capable of even engaging in trade with non-Jews because of anti-Semitism. So
Oh.
part of the story has to do with ingenuity and creativity of having
Hmm.
poverty as at every corner of your life.
That is fascinating. That makes a lot of sense. Wow. Okay. Cool. And what is Yiddish? I mean, is that just another term for Ashkenazi, or is that something else?
Yiddish was probably a bastardized German language, uh,
Oh.
and it was particular to Ashkenazis. My mother speaks Yiddish, believe it or not.
Oh.
And it's when you hear people speaking Yiddish, it sounds like weird German and weird English. Uh,
Oh.
Mhm.
So, and obviously the Yiddish language has a lot of chutzpah, which means a
Mhm.
lot of energy and a lot of, amazingly, for such a small language, which was spoken by such few people, it has entered into the English language.
Yeah.
Spritz, spritzing water, or
Is oy vey Yiddish?
Yeah, that's the
yes.
Yiddish word. Yeah.
Okay, so because sometimes people even use oy vey.
Right.
Not that
Mhm.
But
often, but
I'll have you know, if you take a look, just because they spoke Yiddish, it doesn't mean that they didn't read Hebrew, because the text was
uh,
probably still in Hebrew. And if you take a look at the mice at the bottom of the book,
yeah.
I believe that they are reading Hebrew.
Oh.
That's a good
Wow,
question.
so it seems like there's so much to this story, so much of this context based on the Jewish experience.
Yeah, it's
Because
entirely a Jewish book, but I don't think that the meaning is lost at all.
oh no, no,
It's
no. But I'm saying some of that
universal.
subtext, like the granddad being a tailor and why you had Jewish granddad tailors, I didn't realize there was that kind
But
of
but don't you
archetype.
but don't you think that you come from a British background? Do you think that this
Mhm.
story could be work in a British context?
Oh yeah, it still works. It still works.
Yeah, definitely. This is almost like documentary style. What was it like in Eastern Europe in the 17th, 18th century for Jews who, were in a small knit community? And there's other, I don't have the book in front of me, but there's lots of images of life, what normal market life would be like.
I would say that like the actual the Jewish part comes from all the illustrations, which are, yeah, like as John mentioned, they really show what like life was like in a, a Jewish community at that time. I think the story itself, it feels pretty universal to me. It's just a
Yeah,
folk
definitely.
tale, but it could come from any culture. But if you read it with the illustrations, it really gives you an idea of what a Jewish shtetl would have been like in the 19th century.
It's really interesting. Wow, this is a really historically rich story, eh? With a lot of subtext behind it. Not subtext, context? Historical fabric? I don't know.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think the merchant class is when you're thinking about like the Dutch in the 16th century and Jewish money lending and what
Yeah.
was that Shakespeare book? You know,
The Merchant
that
of Venice.
Merchant of Venice kind of era. And this is more secluded farm life, more like Fiddler on the Roof kind of era or
Oh.
culture. Um, it's not cosmopolitan. It doesn't feel that way. It feels like a small community in a small town that gets by doing their own. Yeah,
Hmm.
this is Poland. Basically, it's like the breadbasket where everyone's a farmer
Well, they're
and you
either
live
farmer.
off the land.
Well, yeah, I mean, either they were a farmer or they were like, the most educated people were like basically studying the Torah all the time, right?
Well,
So,
Hey, one question. Did you feel that like there was any reference to the Torah in this? Like any Torah stories or anything?
the mice. I mean, some of the illustrations, I think, what got into that, but I don't think the
Yeah.
story itself.
Okay. Okay.
that's more powerful
Mm.
than having, material wealth, which is what I thought the book was really about, which was materialism will not lead you to happiness or longevity of happiness.
Yeah, and I just adding on to that, I think that if there's a Jewish theme, like I don't know about Jonathan, but my family they had to leave from place to place, and they often didn't have a lot, but what they could have was things like their writing and their books. So the idea here is that you don't, instead of your material possession, you take what's in your mind and you can make something out of it. So that's kind of a Jewish theme.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I thought that the whole point of it too was like it's not the point of the materials themselves, but the experiences that those materials bring. So even once the material's gone, you've got that experience, and it kind of makes sense in the from an outsider, from the experience of the Jewish community then, because there were a lot of pogroms, a lot of
Program.
discrimination, violations. So you had to, have but you couldn't hold on to material things, like put all your time in material things and power, because that could get taken away so quickly from you.
Right. So
If you,
it's got a long-lasting meaning, which is so great about this book. Again, I don't know if children under the age of even 12 are really gonna grasp the heaviness
mm,
of the concept. Because children, and I think all children, which is interesting, are materialistic. That toys have value, and the creating your own toy versus having a store-bought toy, like it's kind of night and day. You want the store-bought one because it's perfect. It's really well designed, as opposed to, oh, let me just draw it out, cut it out, and then I'm pretending I have the toy. So I sometimes think about the evolution of toys when it comes to families of that era. What would a toy be for a child? And,
mm.
what would have value? And
When was this book written, can I ask? Does anybody know? Story.
I think it's only from the 90s, but
Which date it is.
it says in the book that it's a Yiddish folktale, which,
Hmm.
it's like you're never going to
Mm,
pinpoint when the original author was. Power of this story is that it's so universal and it will last forever, that the older you are, the more you realize objects do not provide happiness. Experiences, like every Harvard and Yale study demonstrates, that experiences are far more valuable than material objects.
yeah.
And that the evolution of a child to a youth to an adult is part of that awareness. And so what's interesting about the story is that the grandfather is this fixer and solves everything. And in the end, the boy becomes like his grandfather. He becomes old and wise because he creates a story that is solving the problem of materialism. If he makes it universal, he makes it infinite.
You know what's interesting about this? What I like about this story is that most stories have that have a deep meaning, kind of like the Giving Tree that we did yet last week, that kind of has a heavy, dark aspect to it, right? Like in that case, the tree lost itself physically.
I was talking to my daughters about it today. She saw a lot of parallels between this book and The Giving Tree, because it was basically like there was a tree and it kept taking and taking until it was basically nothing. And in the same sense, it was taking and taking and taking until, I mean, this was literally nothing. So they kind of saw a parallel there.
It's kind of just the natural progression of things, that the blanket is no longer really useful as
Yeah,
a blanket.
it's actually creative instead of destructive, I guess. So it's a much more positive message. The grandfather was endlessly creative and was always trying to reinvent things and take material and rebuild it. And I'm just wondering, have we lost that skill? And what does this book say about it?
An enormous topic today, because it's basically the concept of right to repair, and corporations are entering the space. You know, this book would be 2 pages long if we applied right to repair legislation that's going on with Apple.
That's what this book's about, right to repair legislation.
You know, it's the story of a boy and his grandfather. And I'm just wondering if you think the gender roles are important. If a girl and a grandmother would have made a difference, or you think there's anything specific about both the characters being male that's important for this book?
Why is it boys? I mean, the author is a female. Why didn't she pick?
Maybe. I mean, I asked my wife what she thought, and she said that if it had been a girl, the girl would have had to do it all herself. Like, I don't know. Maybe it was because it was a boy. They were more indulgent.
So the boy wasn't taught how to modify the dress, how to modify, like what you're saying is that had it been a girl with her grandfather or a girl with her grandmother, she would have been told to engage in the activity of changing the material.
Yeah, I maybe that it would have been a different story, right? Because it's a boy, he was treated differently in this, especially at this time in Eastern Europe. Maybe the girl would have been, she wouldn't have been indulged like that. She would have been told to make the dress herself.
Right, because her passage wouldn't seem as important, the passage to becoming a woman or the passage to do these things.
Maybe.
Passage.
I don't know if it's a matter of importance, rather a role. Everyone has a role in life. And if the grandfather's role was to be a tailor, and all tailors in the community are traditionally men, then the story wouldn't have worked if it was a grandmother. So it might be the legacy of roles, gendered roles in society.
Yeah, I mean, it could have been. I mean, the fact is, we're 3 guys talking about it, but you know, so we only have that male perspective, and it's a male. But you know, it would be interesting, you know, if as a woman, like what if they would have had a different perspective on it.
Do you think this book is appropriate for children?
Definitely.
I think you're going to enjoy it on any level, because it's a lot of repetition. And
yes.
I think it's a fun, even if you don't understand the full meaning, you can just enjoy the story, right? No, it's just very interesting even for a kid to see what this grandfather is going to make next. You know, yeah, I would definitely. I think this is a great book for anybody, right?
And the artwork's beautiful.
Exactly,
yes.
And you know, I think the artwork is actually a really important part, because cultural aspect of what's happening at that time in Eastern Europe. So it's.
So do you think that materialism leads to happiness?
I think there's a point where I think materialism is important to a certain point, and that there's diminishing returns.
At what age does a child recognize materialism?
Oh, I think that depends upon the child, their experiences in life and everything. Like if you had everything provided to you, um, maybe you can learn it much sooner, but if you grew up in grinding poverty, that might really affect you. And it might just naturally burn in a real emphasis on materialism, like Depression survivors, right? Great Depression survivors.
But the child, I think, in this story is poor. And
Mm.
so what I find interesting is that the child is poor, the family is poor, and of course, through necessity, they continue the cloth and the material into a new concept. And one escape out of poverty is sort of, it takes a leap, a massive leap, which is the leap he takes to take from the material to the infinite. So that's why, I mean, I just think the book is genius.
Oh, it's a very good story, definitely. Um,
Mhm.
but I think the thing with your sense of poverty, it's always relative. Like that's what makes globalism so tough, right? The poorest
Hmm.
people today can see how the 1% live. Like, would those Jewish people have any idea of how the top people lived in their society and what that was like back then? Would they have any idea? They might have a couple of stories coming to them, but would they really appreciate that? You know, they can't go look into the king's bedroom like we could now, right?
Well, they would probably have stories like, the Tsar has, 15 bedrooms and, silver,
Mm,
silverware and stuff like
yeah. But I'm saying it might not be as grinding at the same time. Like they might not be, it might not be as psychologically heavy as it
Yeah.
would be now. Like you're growing up in a Brazilian favela, you know what I mean? And you can see how Kim Kardashian's
Yeah,
living.
I think,
That's much more intense, I think. That's
yeah,
the
I think
difference.
you're right because now with social media and like the kind of images you're presented with, like, people are jealous of what they could possibly have, and now there's so many images of success that it makes you more materialistic. I think naturally. In those situations, like in this shtetl, like if they compare themselves to anybody, it would be the more prosperous people in their community because that are the people they see the most often, right?
Okay, so Doug, in your opinion, on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, what would you give the book, and would you recommend it?
Oh, I give it maybe a 9 or a 5. On a 1 to 5, I give it like a 5 or 4.75 because I just think it's a really good book. It's a really nice, interesting story. Um, the artwork's great. I mean, there's that interesting historical background or context, and yeah, I think it's pretty appropriate for kids. I like it.
And Daryl?
Yeah, again, I agree with everything Doug said. I would give it like, 5 stars. I think it's a great book. Definitely worth reading for your
Okay.
kids.
Mm.
I too would give it 5 stars, but I think it's for older kids or for adults every adult should read the book just for themselves. And that's it.
Okay, join us next week when we'll have another book. Thanks, guys.